Hey, John here. um, we labeled this game of logging homework for level 1. And what we mean by that is if you're someone who's relatively comfortable running a saw, cut firewood and so on, but the whole idea of felling a tree is new or not real comfortable with it yet, we wanted to give you a homework assignment, something you can practice even before you get to the level 1 day. And we're going to go into great detail with all kinds of different felling techniques and so on. It's not like if you've been running a saw for years, you wouldn't benefit from a level 1. Everybody starts at level 1. We get through the fundamentals, and then we move on to the more we call it the production type mode and difficult trees and all that kind of stuff as we get through the program. This is just the basics. 2 issues I'd like to cover: making the notch, and then just a basic stance as you approach the tree. So the idea here is trying to make it as effortless as possible when we're handling a saw. So quickly I talk about the stance. If I'm going to come up here to fall this tree, what we'll talk about is bring your knee in behind the tree, look at your felling direction. I think of it as square your shoulders to your target, and we'll be explaining how to use the sight line and all of that. But this is just the basic idea. Left knee against the tree, and if it even works that you can rest your shoulder against the tree, and it's a very comfortable stance, very easy to do, minimal effort. Now, making the notch, what we'll show you here is holding the saw so that the angle cutting down is roughly 60 degrees. We'll mess with that a little bit, but it's roughly 60 degrees, and I'll show you how we mark our saw with a piece of tape. That helps a lot. So we make a down cut and then come out and bring in the bottom cut. So let me just do that, and then I'll discuss a little bit. Now you'll notice I really haven't moved. You see where my left knee is staying on the tree? And we'll talk about anchor points and just stability. Again, making the effort as minimalist as we can. Now the other is when I come in with a bottom cut, what I'm looking at. As I come in with a bottom cut, I'm looking down through my top cut, and I'll put a picture here to show you just what I mean. But I want to be watching for my bar to come into that first cut. Don't go past it. What we try to do is come right in to the absolute bottom of your first cut. That's what we call a perfect notch. In other words, those 2 cuts come together perfectly. One doesn't go past the other. We would call that bypass. We would have to fix it. So again, without starting the saw, I set up, I can check my aim, I make my down cut at the angle that I want. When I'm happy with the hinge length that I want, I come out, come in from the bottom, and as I'm cutting in, I'm watching down through the curve to make sure I don't go past that cut. This is something, and you'll notice, I cut the tree off, cut a high stump. And this is the point of sort of being a homework assignment. This is something where even if you're not comfortable yet with falling trees, if you know someone who is, cut the tree off, at about shoulder high. Don't get above your shoulders. That gets dangerous. I cut this with a machine. But the idea is, if you get rid of the tree, okay, it kind of takes some of the nervousness out of practice making these cuts. Then you can practice this idea all over this stump. And the parallel that I use a lot through the training is the cuts start to become like tying your shoes. The first time we tried to tie our shoes, had to kind of pay attention and slow down. This type of felling, it becomes literally automatic. You know, the muscle memory is just right there. You practice being precise and accurate, and it just flows very nicely. But you got to be accurate. You know, another saying I like to play off of is the old saying that practice makes perfect, and that is not true at all, unless the practice is perfect. The real key you want to keep in mind is repetition makes permanence. So if this idea here, you know, handling the saw is relatively new, or you've been running a saw for a while and you know you're picking up on some ideas, keep in mind, if you've already run a saw for years, you have permanence in the way you do things. Trying to change that is kind of frustrating, but it changes over time. But if it's the first time you're practicing, make the practice perfect, and then the speed comes up and it's automatic. Okay? I'm going to show you quick here what I mean by making notches all over this tree. Yeah, I hope you get the idea. I started off with the first notch, talking about the knee against the tree, shoulder against the tree. That's, what we call like the textbook scenario. In the real world, you do what you can, but the idea is those anchor points, so you got your saw stable, make your cuts accurate. Hope this helps. Give it some try, and look forward. Okay, so I want to explain a couple of things that I mentioned out there in the woods with notching the post. I mentioned putting tape on the handlebars. So here's what I mean. If you look on what I used to call the corner of the handlebar, but that was, folks had a hard time understanding what I mean by the corner. So all it is, if the saw is setting level, you can see I put a piece of red tape right there. And the idea is I can hold that, and just the way the saw hangs in my hand, that is giving you the top cut angle that you would go into your tree. That's just to basically, again, mention the 60 degrees. Don't get too hung up on the number, but that's the concept there. And then I put another piece of tape here in the bottom corner of the handlebar, and there is where I hold it when I make the second cut. It's going to give me a little bit of an uppercut, and that opens the angle up for that. The name that's commonly attached to that is an open face notch. That's the basic. And of course, as we get into more advanced felling and different tree situations, we start to manipulate that notch, and we can do all kinds of things with it. But that's the basics. Now, one other thing to kind of give you a little heads up on this is how far into the tree to make that first cut. And what I'm hoping here, if we can see, get out of the glare, is this idea of making your first cut down in so that you get a face across the tree, which is roughly, or we always say, a minimum of 80% of the tree's total diameter. And I hope this works for you, but if I were to make, I'm looking at the tree here straight onto the notch, and I make that first cut down, and I only cut in, say 2 inches. Okay, so let's say I cut in, now I'm looking the felling direction is to the right. You know, the felling direction is going that way. So if I were to cut down into the tree just that much, that hinge is only going to be, say, about that long, right here. That's not 80% of the total. So I need to cut in a little further. Now I'm getting it, now the hinge is going to be a little bit longer, but I'm not quite there yet. So I might go even a little bit further. And you see I'm going to get back into where this distance right here, which will end up being the length of the hinge, we want to have at least 80% of the 100% of the tree's diameter. So I'm hoping that'll help you kind of get a heads up or a little bit of a kickstart on this level 1 day when we start talking about, you know, making the felling plan. And hinge wood length. Hinge wood length, that there is really important to understand when we're making the notch. There's an old school principle out there of making a notch a third of the way into the tree. And that only applies if the tree happens to be a perfect circle. And most of our trees are not perfect circles. They can get in all kinds of weird shapes. So we want to be thinking about making the notch into the tree to the point where the distance across that hinge wood is at least 80% of the tree's 100% diameter. Hope that helps. Again, a little something to try before we get together for a level 1, and it will help a lot with getting into the more complicated scenarios with the real tree felling. So hopefully we'll see you soon. Take care.